There is an old story about a man trying to cross a river. The current was strong, the banks were far apart, and there was no bridge. For some time, he simply watched the flow of the water, trying to understand if there was another way across. There wasn't, so he decided to build a small boat using what he could find nearby, simple pieces of wood, carefully tied together. Nothing sophisticated, just enough to float. He stepped into the boat, pushed it into the water, and began to cross. The crossing required attention. His body needed balance, and his mind needed to remain present. At times, the current seemed stronger than he was. At other moments, progress was almost imperceptible. Even so, little by little, he continued, until, after some time, he reached the other bank. The river was now behind him. He stepped out of the boat, but instead of leaving it there, he lifted it onto his shoulders and continued walking. The weight began to bother him. His steps became slower. The path became more difficult. Someone passing by observed the scene and asked why he was carrying that boat. The man replied with conviction that it was the boat that had brought him there and that it would be wrong to abandon it now. This story is known as the Parable of the Raft, attributed to the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, around the 5th century before the Common Era. It was not created for beginners. It was directed toward experienced practitioners, people who had already understood something essential but were at risk of becoming attached to their own understanding. For this reason, this is not a story about ignorance. It is a story about attachment to what once worked. The river represents a condition of suffering, confusion, or limitation, something that needed to be crossed. The boat represents a method, an idea, a practice, a belief, a mental model. The most common mistake when interpreting this parable is to think it teaches that we should not become attached to anything. That is not the point. The teaching is more subtle and more uncomfortable. The boat is not a mistake. It fulfilled exactly the function for which it was created. The problem begins when something that helped us cross a difficult phase continues to be carried as if it were still necessary. In everyday life, we do this all the time. We create ways of thinking, acting, and protecting ourselves in order to survive certain contexts. These strategies work, they stabilize us and allow us to move forward. But time passes, the context changes, and we continue carrying the same internal structures. In psychology, this often appears as adaptive strategies that become dysfunctional, something that was intelligent in a specific moment in life, but outside that context begins to limit us. The problem is not fear, it is continuing to act as if the danger were still present. The problem is not control, it is maintaining control when the chaos is already past. The problem is not belief, it is defending it because without it, we no longer know who we are. Many people build their entire identity around something that was once necessary, a trauma that was overcome, a difficult phase, a worldview that made sense at a certain moment in life. And abandoning it does not feel like growth, it feels like loss. Because letting go of the boat requires admitting that the crossing is over, and that is deeply uncomfortable. The parable does not condemn the boat, it questions the moment when it continues to be carried. Perhaps maturity is not about accumulating answers, methods, or truths, but about learning to release them at the right moment. Perhaps growth is not about finding something definitive, but about recognizing what brought us here has already fulfilled its role. And perhaps the greatest human mistake is not crossing difficult rivers, but continuing to live as if we were still trapped on shores that are already behind us.